Dr. Jonathan Reyes. Dr. Reyes is the Executive Director for the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He served as Director of Social Ministry for the Archdiocese of Denver. In his work in Denver, he co-founded and became the first president of the Augustine Institute. He was the Vice President for Campus Ministry and Leadership Formation for the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, Focus, in Denver. Dr. Reyes received his doctorate in European History from the University of Notre Dame in 2000 and his Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Michigan. Today, Dr. Reyes will present Gaudium et Spes through the eyes of Pope Francis. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Reyes to the podium.
All right, so you're at the end of a long day. And my goal is to say something of substance without putting you to sleep. I'm a professor for many years. I'm quite good at putting people to sleep. And I've learned to not take it personally if you do sleep. However, if you drool on the person next to you, they might take it personally. So I recommend you don't do that. Do feel free to have coffee. Feel free to stand up if you start fading the post-lunch blues. Because I do want to try to communicate something of substance about Gaudium et Spes and Pope Francis's relationship to that document. I will also quote freely from Pope Francis and the document at a few key moments to show you the similarities of language and to also justify what I'm saying, so it doesn't simply stay at the level of generalization. The other reason I want to quote somewhat extensively, and I won't overdo it, but if you want the longer quotes, I'll have them, is I think it's important to remember that the words we use matter and the beauty with which we use words. And Pope Francis is an effective communicator of a certain kind. Papal documents, Gaudium et Spes was unique in its language. It was actually meant to be poetic and lyrical, and so parts of it are. It's meant to grab in a certain way. And then I will quote once from John Henry Newman because I never give a talk to college students in which I don't. Okay. He's one of my heroes. So he also had a big influence on the council and continues to have an intellectual influence on Catholicism in the 20th and 21st century. Okay, so what do I want to do? First, the title of my talk, Gaudium et Spes through the eyes of Pope Francis. Let me clarify what I mean by that. Pope Francis has not written extensively on what he thinks Gaudium et Spes means. He has not dived into the many controversies coming out of Gaudium et Spes over the interpretations of it and the controversial passages like paragraph 36, in which theologians debate the relationship between the supernatural and the natural. Some of you know this, you're theologians. I'm not a theologian, I'm not going there. I'm glad Francis doesn't. So we're not climbing into it in that sense, that Pope Francis has not written an interpretation of the doc. I will argue, and I think it's clear as day, though, that he was fundamentally formed by that document. He uses language from it quite frequently, and that his sort of orientation, not just in his apostolic exhortation, but for his whole life, has been to sort of implement the missionary call of Gaudium et Spes, that he's living it, and he's calling us to live it. So what I'm going to do basically is link Pope Francis to the document in his own life, in his own words to us, and try to link you to it, and say that the mission of Gaudium et Spes is the mission of John Paul II, is the mission of Benedict XVI, is the mission that Pope Francis keeps articulating and is in Evangelii Gaudium, and is the mission we have to live, particularly as leaders. Okay, so that's how I'm going to do it. You've heard a lot about the document itself and some of its context. I'd like to give you a slightly broader, I'd like to start by giving a slightly broader historical context. And I'm stealing these comments from what I think was one of the best summaries, which came from Cardinal George, God rest his soul. So I just want to make that clear that I'm stealing with impunity. There's a footnote here, but it won't show up on the top. When John the 23rd called the Second Vatican Council, he issued a document called On Human Salvation in 1961, December 25th, Christmas of 1961, in which he explained why have the Second Vatican Council. It's not a long document, you can look it up. And if you see it, you'll notice something interesting about it. That he's not calling it because he's worried about something in the church. He's fundamentally calling it because he's worried about something in the world. And I don't mean that in the biblical sense of the evil of the world. I just mean it, the broader human society. If you read that doc, you don't see the church needs to get its doctrine right on the following 10 things. It never says that. What it says is the world needs the church. Consider some history for a moment from John the 23rd's own history. John the 23rd served in the Italian army in the First World War. And so he was witness to Catholics killing other Catholics in the name of the nation state. John the 23rd lived through and witnessed the communist revolution. And so he witnessed classes of people killing other classes of people in the name of justice. John the 23rd saw the rise of fascism and other totalitarian dictates, many of which were premised on the human race destroying itself or destroying one another based on race or human ethnicity. In the East, condemning a whole sets of people to serfdom, Slavs, and in the case of Nazi Germany, condemning a set of people to death. He saw World War II and the use of nuclear weapons, and right around 1961, 1962, he was actually engaged in the Cuban Missile Crisis and in some conversations with the parties to try to bring peace there. In other words, he also saw the potential of the human race and saw it come very close to blowing itself up literally with the use of nuclear bombs for ideological reasons. So what John the 23rd saw was a world set to destroy itself, at enmity with itself, and willing to annihilate itself. And according to Cardinal George, his reaction was to say, someone, somebody, something needs to tell the human race that you're a human family. Something from outside these divisions needs to step in and say, you're all part of the same family. And he said the church needs to do that. The church is the mechanism, the voice, by which the whole human race can hear that it's a human family. In order to do that, therefore, the church needs to become a partner in conversation with that wider world. And here's the shift. A church that had up to this time largely been concerned about its own inner workings now has a mission to go tell the world that it's one human family and to rethink its relationships with one another. Small example, just so you know where the world was. In the 1960s, in terms of international agreements and international relations, leading secular theories on how nations should relate to each other were premised on the idea that every nation has its own competing interests, and the goal of international law and international agreement is to just get them to agree to give each other enough space to pursue their own interests without elbowing one another. So just it's competition out there, let everybody, we need rules to govern the competition. John the 23rd, shortly before his death, writes Pacem in Terris, this famous encyclical, Peace on Earth, in which he says, no, actually, that's not the right model for the relationship between nations. The right model is actually one human family. It was very cutting edge at the time for him to say that there was a global common good, something we all share and should pursue together. It was absolutely radical in the 1960s. We assume that now, but that largely came out of the church's own reflecting on these issues. So, the council itself is fundamentally ordered to changing the world. And as part of that, to change the church enough to be able to be of service to the world. Does that make sense? It's not fundamentally about we need to rethink the church. We do need to make some adjustments in order to fulfill this mission. So the Vatican Council is called the Missionary Council. It's a missionary council. We're setting the church on its mission. And that's what that whole first thing, we read it, I'll read pieces of it again. that Archbishop read earlier, the whole first paragraph is all mission. The church in relationship to the world in order to carry out its mission. This is the quote. Now listen to it in this context now. Listen to the beginning of Gaudium et Spes in that historical context I just gave you. The joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. The church cares about the world. It's fundamental to her because she shares in the humanity of the world. Therefore, the council focuses its attention on the world of men, the whole human family, along with the sum of those realities in the midst of which it lives. That world which is the theater of man's history, pardon the gender-exclusive language, but this is 1960s, and the heirs of his energies, his tragedies and his triumphs. That world which the Christian sees as created and sustained by its Maker's love, fallen indeed into the bondage of sin, yet emancipated now by Christ. The fundamental orientation of Gaudium et Spes is the missionary piece of the Vatican Council. Go to the world and bring it good news. Okay, that's the first piece. That lays the groundwork. What then does Gaudium et Spes do? The second thing it does is it says, well, let's assess what's going on out there. What is going on? This is where we get the signs of the times language, which became a mantra for all kinds of things. Just bracket that for those of you who know the history. Just know that there was a question of what's the world like? Okay, so the world needs us. What's wrong with it? What's right about it? What do we need to do to help it? The whole second half of Gaudium et Spes deals with specific problems. Political, socioeconomic, peace on earth, you name it, okay? But the fundamental problem, the one that the document starts with, and it starts with and mentions right in paragraph 10, which is still part of the introduction, is the following. In the face of the modern development of the world, the number constantly swells of the people who raise the most basic questions or recognize them with a new sharpness. What is man? What is this sense of sorrow, of evil, of death, which continues to exist despite so much progress? What purpose have these victories purchased at so high a cost? He's talking about technology. What can man offer to society? What can he expect from it? What follows this earthly life? In other words, end quote. The fundamental issue is what is a human being and what are the answers to these most basic questions? It goes on to note all the other questions, political, social, justice questions, international, how we structure our polity. All those questions follow from how a culture answers these most basic questions. How you answer what a human being is and for, what's good, what's evil, why does it exist, those determine your answers to culture. And so Gaudium et Spes starts and says that a lot of problems out there, but the one we got to focus on is the answer to the most basic questions. Then it answers that question. That's all of part one of the whole document. The introduction's over. It's laid out the problem. And now it answers it. And what does it say? This is the one that's on human dignity. What is a human being? There's a lot of beautiful lines from this section of Gaudium et Spes. The one that John Paul II loves and Benedict used and sort of used as the whole interpretive guide of the document is paragraph 22, in which he says only Christ can reveal to the human race who they really are. It's only by knowing Christ that a human being knows who he or she is. But I want to quote from paragraph 19. Paragraph 19 says the following. The root reason for human dignity lies in man's call to communion with God. I want to repeat that so you catch it. The root reason for human dignity, why there is this dignity that we're exploring and talking about, lies in man's call to communion with God. And it goes on to explain two things. Why human beings have dignity. One we recognize, the other sometimes I don't think we think of. Maybe you've been well educated and you do. The first is made in the image and likeness of God. Fair enough. My kids get that. God made us. God makes nice things. God likes us. He made us. Beautiful. There's a second dimension to our dignity, though, which has to do with where we're going. That is that we have a destiny. That part of our dignity is embedded in and relies upon our fulfillment of our destiny to be with Christ, to be with God forever. Or as the Greeks used to say, to be divinized, in some sense, the proper sense of that word. To partake of God's own nature in the appropriate way in which a human being can. In other words, dignity is rooted in where you're starting from as a creature made, but also in that starting point is a call. Your dignity is something you're given and something you achieve with God's grace. This is extremely important. Why? Because when it comes time to talk about what does a just social order look like, how should economics work, how should politics work, one of the questions is, what will allow human beings to fulfill their destiny? Be with me on this. So when Catholic social teaching worries about a just social order, it doesn't just say, make sure everybody's okay. It starts there. You got to have food, you got to have housing, you got to have clothing. But it also says things like, you have a right to education. Now, people don't need education to survive. They need education to fulfill their destiny. And thirdly, because their destiny is not ultimately simply on this earth, they need the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's actually owed to them, because that is essential to the fulfilling of their highest destiny, which is union with God. So the church starts with the most basic material needs and goes all the way up to the deepest spiritual needs. People are sometimes surprised by Pope Francis. In Evangelii Gaudium, he had this interesting line in which he said, the greatest poverty of the poor and the outside is lack of spiritual care. When we think of Pope Francis, we think of saying the greatest poverty is they don't have water, they don't have food, or they're excluded, they're thrown away, they're forgotten. All true. But he has this interesting line in Evangelii Gaudium which throws a lot of people, where he says the greatest need, the greatest poverty is their lack of pastoral leadership, their lack of spiritual care for them. You can only believe that's a poverty if you believe that human beings' dignity are tied to a destiny that's transcendent and that they're owed the ability to get there. And this is what, in paragraph 19, Gaudium et Spes is saying. You can't think of justice or caring for human beings and take the transcendent dimension out. John Paul II said that, Benedict said that, and Francis have all said that. So let me just change this to you. I just want to put this to you for you Catholic leaders, and I know some of you just went through a workshop with Peter Murphy on how to actually share your story and talk about sharing the gospel. Every human being in justice is owed the gospel. It's an act of justice, that they're owed to hear the word of God. They don't have to accept it. No one can make them accept it. They cannot be coerced into it. You cannot be stupid about how you do it. Well, you can be. It won't work. But they're owed it because it's inherent to their dignity. And thus Gaudium et Spes, right away, talks about human dignity not just as how you're made, but how you're destined, and the need for the gospel to fulfill it. Therefore, what's the solution to the world's problems? Ultimately, at the deepest level, the gospel, Jesus Christ. That is the solution. And that's what we get in part 1. Then, all of part 2 is, now that we know that, let's start talking about specifics. And some of the specifics in the second part of Gaudium et Spes are still, they're downright prophetic and still relate. Some seem a little dated because they seem to be dealing with questions at a certain time or way of talking about them. But the point is they flow from part 1. Fair enough? So what's the project of Gaudium et Spes? The church needs to go into the world because the world needs it. And the church needs to change just enough to be able to communicate with the world. And I don't mean change in fundamental doctrine. I mean just in its approach. It has a mission. The fundamental problem, it needs to help human beings understand who they are, where they're destined, and then it can start commenting on how to help them fulfill that great destiny. The answer always starts and ends with Jesus Christ. Now let's turn to Francis. Let's turn to Francis. You're with me so far? What's Francis say? Francis had an interesting moment. I think people overlook certain moments. His first major public moment, global public moment as Pope, other than when he was elected, was really, when everyone was sort of watching him, was really World Youth Day. And they're wondering, how is he going to handle World Youth Day? John Paul II was a rock star. Benedict, they loved him too, despite the fact that people thought they wouldn't. They still loved him. How's he going to handle World Youth Day? I'm going to take a few comments he made from World Youth Day. The first thing he takes, I want to take a line that he borrows from a document that was written by the Latin American bishops called Aparecida, which is a very important document that he helped write. He was the chief editor of it. So when you read this document, and I'm deliberately skipping over the story of this document because I don't want to lose you, but I'd be happy to fill in any of these details. Very important document. Aparecida is the town in which it's written in, known for Aparecida, or an apparition of Our Lady, in which the bishops of Latin America got together and wrote a document saying, what is the mission of the church to Latin America? What is our mission? So this is a mission document. This is the Gaudium et Spes of Latin America. And Pope Francis was the chief editor of it, not Pope at the time. And he actually insisted certain language in that document was changed and moved to the front of the document. When he goes to World Youth Day, he quotes it. One of the first things he says to the bishops of Brazil, to his brother bishops, you're wondering, what is this guy going to say? What are the utterances he's going to say? He quotes Aparecida, and he quotes this interesting line. The line goes like this: ours is not an age of change, but the change of an age. Ours is not an age of change, where things are constantly changing. He's not denying that. What he's saying is there's something more significant going on. There's a fundamental shift, the change of an age. I want to take from World Youth Day, he's speaking to the bishops. He then goes on to describe this change. And I want to read this to you. And it sounds like the same problem Gaudium et Spes acknowledged. Okay? You got Gaudium et Spes, human beings not answering fundamental questions. Here's Francis's version of the problem. And look, Francis is not denigrating the world or anything. We know that about him, right? But he's pointing out a problem here, right? He says a relentless process of globalization, an often uncontrolled process of urbanization have promised great things. Just like Gaudium et Spes says, technology, there seems to be great promise. But, and he says, while it has many positive elements, but many people completely overlook the darker side. Now here's the darker side. The loss of a sense of life's meaning, personal dissolution, a loss of the experience of belonging to any nest whatsoever, any home, subtle but relentless violence, the inner fragmentation and breakup of families, loneliness and abandonment, divisions, and the inability to love, to forgive, to understand, the inner poison which makes life a hell, the need for affection because of feelings of inadequacy and unhappiness, the failed attempt to find an answer in drugs, alcohol, and sex, which only become further prisons, the great sense of abandonment and solitude, of not even belonging to oneself, which often results from this situation, is too painful to hide. What a great line. The sense of abandonment and not belonging to oneself. So what's the problem? Loss of a sense of life's meaning, fragmentation of relationships, isolation, abandonment. Why does the Pope talk about a culture of exclusion? Why does he talk about a throwaway culture? Why does he talk about the margins? Because these are the people who are abandoned, isolated, on their own, forgotten. And they don't know what life's for. And there are people running after various distractions, as Archbishop said earlier, simply to fill a hole in their life that they can't fill in any other way. And it leads them to what Benedict called in a different place, lethal boredom. That frenetic boredom, which is so true of so many people, chasing after things all the time, bored stiff, and not finding any answers to these deeper questions. Note the diagnosis. It's the diagnosis of Gaudium et Spes with a deeper sort of existential, more experiential kind of feel to it. Mother Teresa came to, I've told this story before, I hope for those who've heard, forgive me. But Mother Teresa spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in 1994, I believe. And she was sharing, this is one of her first times at the States, I believe, and she had gone to visit some of the homes for the elderly that her sisters ran. And she said she walked in and she was at first blown away by them. They were clean, they were big, there was food everywhere, there were smiling people serving the elderly and helping. And you can imagine one of these homes, you walk in and there's the TVs in the front room and the couches, and there's the doors you come in and there's people sitting there. And she said, but she quickly noticed that all the people who were living there were just sort of sitting, ignoring what was going on and just staring at the front door. And so she said she turned to her sister and said, why are they staring at the front door? Look at this. And she says, the sister said, it's always like this. They're staring at the front door, waiting for a son or daughter to walk through, because they've been forgotten. And to be forgotten is the greatest poverty. Isolation, loneliness, breakdown, exclusion, marginalization. No sense of life's meaning, isolated, inability to forgive, to love, to understand. In his World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis talked, what do we need to do? And he gave this line. He says, in his encyclical, Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, my predecessor reminded the world how the lack of fraternity, fellowship between peoples and men and women is a significant cause of poverty. I deliberately choose this quote because if Pope Francis is the Pope of poverty, when he says cause of poverty, you want to pay attention to that. So here's a significant cause of poverty, breakdown of relationship. Continued. In many societies, we are experiencing a profound poverty of relationships as a result of the lack of solid family and community relationships. We are concerned by the various types of hardship, marginalization, isolation, and various forms of pathological dependencies which we see increasing. This kind of poverty can be overcome only through the rediscovery and valuing of fraternal relationships in the heart of families and communities, through the sharing of joys and sorrows, of the hardships and triumphs that are part of human life. That's the very opening lines of Gaudium et Spes, right? So Pope Francis is basically re-articulating the mission of Gaudium et Spes. He sees the same problem, and he offers a particular answer, which we shouldn't be surprised is encountering Christ and encountering one another. Let me offer this interesting, no one's, I think, found, a friend of mine pointed this out to me, it's beautiful. Pope Francis gave a speech on the launching of the Spanish version of a book by the founder of Communion and Liberation, right? Luigi Giussani, many of you maybe know him. But he gave a speech on the importance of Giussani's work. This later got put into a book in 2003. Here he's describing exactly what Gaudium et Spes is doing and why Giussani is an answer. And I think you'll see the connections to Gaudium et Spes right away. This is the challenge, Pope Francis said. Faced with the torpor of life, with this tranquility offered at a low cost by our supermarket culture, the challenge consists in asking ourselves the real questions about human meaning of our existence and in answering those questions. Human beings cannot be content with reductive or partial answers that force them to censor or neglect some aspect of reality. We possess with us a yearning for the infinite, which is satisfied only by an equally infinite response. The only response is the encounter. And only with the encounter with Christ is my thirst quenched, end quote. A lot of quotations to prove my point. But it's the exact same answer as Gaudium et Spes. Here's the human problem. Here's the isolation, lack of size meaning, and the isolation. The answer is not a dogma. The answer is not a policy. These are all important. But the answer starts with the encounter. What Pope Francis will say over and over again, you've seen this word with Pope Francis if you look at him, encounters everywhere, encuentro. And encuentro in Spanish, by the way, just so you know, means something a lot thicker than encounter does in English. Okay? It means a real kind of transformative engagement with someone. You're changed by it. It's not just running into someone. There's the problem. There's the solution. Now the challenge. So here's where Pope Francis, and now this is going to be the last piece of this, and I don't want to keep you too long here. What, therefore, ought the church to be in order to bring this encounter to the world? Well, who are we supposed to be? Who's supposed to do the work? Who fulfills the mission? And here there's, I'd say, something that's, development's a loaded theological term, so I don't mean that word, but here's something Francis is emphasizing that maybe doesn't come out in Gaudium et Spes in the same way. What he basically says, and he takes this from the Latin American bishops, and Pope Francis's answer is, in order for the church to go out of itself and be a voice to the world and bring this good news, we have to be a particular way. We Christian leaders have to be a particular way. We have to be particular people. We have to do certain things. And the term that comes out of this document of Parecida, which you will hear Francis use time and time again, it's just starting to catch on, is the term missionary disciples. Missionary disciples. So what's the answer to the problem? The answer is you and me becoming missionary disciples. That's the answer. And it's for everyone. It's not just for clergy. It's not just for religious. It's not for people who make a living off doing this. It's not people who work for the diocese. It's for every single Christian to become a missionary disciple. This is from Evangelii Gaudium 199. Which if you, by the way, if you look at the organization of Evangelii Gaudium, you will see it ends with this precise thing. He lays out the problem. It follows the flow of Gaudium et Spes with some exceptions, very interestingly. But the end is, all right, now what are you going to be like? What's your personal response, my personal response to this challenge? He says, our commitment does not consist exclusively in activities or programs of promotion and assistance. It's not all about programs and promotion. By the way, he's all for those. I'm all for those. I devote my life to supporting them and doing these things. This isn't to marginalize them. What the Holy Spirit mobilizes is not an unruly activism, but above all an attentiveness which considers the other in a certain sense as one with ourselves. This loving attentiveness is the beginning of a true concern for their person, which inspires me effectively to seek their good. This entails appreciating the poor in their goodness, in their experience of life, in their culture, and in their ways of living the faith. True love is always contemplative and permits us to serve the other, not out of necessity or vanity, but rather because he or she is beautiful above and beyond mere appearances. The answer is to create missionary disciples, those who are willing to go out, not do programs, but to encounter the other and bring good news, to have an encuentro, to actually bring Christ to them and encounter Christ in them. This is from a Parecida, and then I'm going to tell you a few stories so you don't die of all these quotes. Here lies the fundamental challenge we face, to show the church's capacity to promote and form disciples and missionaries who respond to the calling received and to communicate everywhere in an outpouring of gratitude and joy. What do we communicate? The gift of the encounter with Jesus Christ. We have no other treasure but that. We have no other happiness, no other priority, but to be the instruments of the Spirit of God as church, so that Jesus Christ may be known, followed, loved, adored, announced, and communicated to all, despite difficulties and resistances. This is the best service that the church has to offer people and nations, end quote. So, it's about us becoming someone, so that we can go meet others and actually bring Christ to them. Let me give you a sense of how this works. First, I want to make a diagnosis that's not Latin American. In Latin America, it is pretty clear. I grew up in Latin America. I spent about 5.5 years of my life in Latin America, in Caracas, Venezuela. I've seen how poverty looks in Latin America. Poverty looks very different because you can see it if you pay attention to it. It's on the mountains. You drive by it every day. You can't get anywhere in a big city like Caracas, where I lived, without seeing the poverty. Okay? In the States, it tends to be more hidden. If you've heard of this recent book and you haven't read it, you should, by Robert Putnam, called Our Kids. Recently came out. It got a fair bit of coverage. This is a sociologist out of Harvard talking about the way in which rich and poor have broken out in the United States. And among many very interesting points, he makes the main point is poverty has become invisible to the middle class, that the world is breaking apart into two groups that don't see one another. This is not a new argument. This argument came earlier from the right in a guy named Charles Murray in another book called The Big Sword. The basic point is this: we don't see poverty anymore because poverty is getting more and more excluded. He tells a wonderful story of the town of Bend, Oregon. Bend, Oregon, a tiny town, lost all its industry at a certain point in the 1970s, had less than 30,000 people, not clear what was going to do, through a set of circumstances, has a boom. It becomes a beautiful vacation spot and has coastal area, etc. So that from about 1970 to about 1990, the population goes from 30,000 to 170,000. Per capita income in Bend, Oregon, goes up 54%. Everybody's making more money. It's wonderful. People are coming in, the beautiful homes are being built, the construction industry, so there's jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Ironically, the number of people below the poverty line during that same 54% growth in per capita income, the number of people below the poverty line doubles. And there grows up a divide in the city, separated literally by a river, in which the people on the one side of the river, where 43% of the children live in poverty, never see the people on the other side of the river, whose kids all go to college and live on the coast. And he did interviews with kids from the city of Bend, and he talked to high school kids in the side that the kids go to college, and he talked to a couple high school kids on the other side. And an interesting quote, he talks to this young man, I think he gave him the name Andrew, who's on the wealthy side of the river. He says, tell me about Bend. And Bend, he says, look, I've been here my whole life. My parents were here. They were part of the boom. Everything is great. Bend is a great town. I want to go to college, come back here. I want to live here the rest of my life. This is the greatest town. People love you. They look out for you, and we don't have any poverty here. I helped launch a program in Denver, Colorado called Christ in the City. Christ in the City, we bring college students in. They give up a year of their life to live in the inner city, near the homeless, because we send them out to where the homeless are. We bring kids from all over. One year we brought a wonderful young person from the city of Chicago area who came to be with us. And one of the first things we do in the program is we take people and we have a formerly homeless person who helps us and takes the students around to where all the homeless people hang out in Denver. All those places in Denver that you never see, even though you live there and you drive through, you never see. Under the bridges, in the tunnels, certain areas where this person said, I don't even go back there, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this person from Chicago, this young woman from Chicago, gets back from that tour and she's really moved by it. It's a very moving experience. And she says, you know, I had no idea you had so much poverty in Denver like this. We don't have this in Chicago. That isn't, I'm not blaming anybody. It's people's experience of life. So in the United States, we have a rupture of relationship, a culture of exclusion. It doesn't look like Latin America, but it's very real, I can assure you. When I took over running Catholic Charities in Denver, I saw a side of Denver where I had lived for 4 years, 5 years, that I had never seen before. I didn't know these places existed. For most people, poverty is someone asking for money at the top of the escalator or at the exit ramp. They have no idea of a much deeper reality out there because they never see it. To address it, we need missionary disciples. People who are willing to go out to those places that they would not otherwise see, and to have encounters with those people that go beyond simply doing a nice, kind act of charity, which is a very good thing to do. The only way we're going to fundamentally address one aspect of poverty, this lack of fraternal relationship that can feed a sense of a lack of life's meaning, etc., is we have to actually get out there. We must be missionary disciples and have an encounter. And it has to be real. It has to be what he describes in Evangelii Gaudium 199, a genuine love of the beauty and the infinite worth of that person. We had a big homeless shelter in Denver called the Samaritan House. The Samaritan House slept about 330 people a night. 50 or 60 of those people would be children, average age 4. Because we had families, we had single people, etc. Running Samaritan House is chaotic. It's crazy. I don't know if you've ever been in a big homeless shelter, but they're like their own ecosystem, and it's fragile, and things can go really wrong really fast, and so you got to have a lot of rules and regulations around them. And if they're like ours, it provided all these services. So there's clothing services, and there's programs, and there's offices, and all these things. Well, every night you lock up Samaritan House, you close the doors at 10 o'clock, you never open them, because you don't want to let anyone in. Nothing good happens after 10. And all that there are on duty are 2 people. And they're overseeing 330 people sleeping all over this building, and you just want to make sure everything's okay. There's all kinds of rules. A Franciscan friar who I got to know very well at Samaritan House and had been there for years tells a story from when he first was working at Samaritan House. And he was at the front desk, and he was working with a young volunteer. And it was just the 2 of them. And it was one of his first nights doing an all-nighter, the all-nighter at Samaritan House. He was a little tense. Snowy, wintry, awful Denver night. Sure enough, about 1 o'clock in the morning, a knock at the door. What do I do? You're not supposed to open the door. This is not a good thing. What can I can't not help. Goes to the door, looks out, sees a homeless person, opens the door, and he says, in comes a woman who he eventually knew as Mary. Mary looked homeless. She'd clearly been on the street. She's wrapped up in hats and scarves, etc., and looked like someone who'd been trying to survive on the street, with one exception. He said he looked down and she had no shoes on. So she'd been wandering the streets of Denver with no shoes on in an awful ice and snowstorm. And so her feet were, of course, bloodied and freezing. She probably had no feeling in them. And she's just standing there, and he's thinking, this is against the rules, but what do I do? So he brings her in, and he puts her on the blue bench. Everyone in Samaritan House, you sit on the blue bench. That's just where you start, and then people figure out what to do with you. Sits her on the blue bench. He's sitting there, and going through his mind are very reasonable questions. What hospitals are open? Can I get into the clothing room? It's supposed to stay locked, and get her some clothing. Is there substance issues here? We have no room. There's nowhere for her to sleep. I can't give her a place to stay. And he says, well, he's having all these very reasonable questions come through his head. This young volunteer had gotten up, gone into the other room, filled a bowl with warm water, put a towel over his shoulder, came back, knelt down in front of her on that blue bench, and started washing her feet. Now, that did not solve her problems, but for a brief moment, Mary actually had some human dignity. She actually knew she was loved. She knew she was valued. Her isolation for a brief moment was penetrated a little bit. And note this, it didn't just, no doubt, have some influence on Mary, we hope. We never saw her again. It certainly changed the volunteer. It also changed the person watching it, such that this friar continues to tell that story and wrote it down. And then I tell that story, and people hear it and think there's something there. In other words, the witness of an encounter changes the person who receives, the person who gives, the person who sees it. It's transformative. If it's a real encounter. This is more than just giving someone something to eat or handing them some money, which are good things. By all means, do them. But if we're going to penetrate this poverty, this isolation, it means actually going and being with people. Part of our vision in Christ in the City is you actually are pretty much living with the homeless. I know that sounds oxymoronic. Where the homeless hang out, you live near them, and you spend your days with them. Precisely so you get to know them. One story that got written up in the local papers was this guy named Bill. And this guy named Bill, he'd been having all kinds of problems, and he said these Christ in the City missionaries got to know me, and he said what was different about him is they kept coming back. They saw me every day. He said, I've had people occasionally come and say, hey, can I help you, buddy? But he said, they just came and they talk every day. And then he shares a story of getting hit by a car one day. He's crossing the street, ends up in the hospital. Said a Christ in the City missionary came to see him every single day in the hospital for 3 weeks. And even after that, continued to spend time with him. These are Bill's words. They helped me get my life back spiritually, even physically. They'll just take you on a human basis. People who've been in the position I was in, we just don't have many people who can talk to us on a normal level. He says this lunch, which is given to them, is wonderful, but that doesn't even touch what they've done for me. I got a lot of my dignity back from them. I don't know how to put it into words, how thankful I am, end quote. This is then in the newspaper, people read it, and then people come and say, what, tell me about this program, never heard of it. They meet the missionaries, they're transformed. What does this have to do with sharing the gospel? What does living the gospel have to share with the gospel? I want to close with two quotations, one from Benedict XVI and one from Cardinal Newman. First from Cardinal Newman. This is a wonderful point. He's asked the question in a sermon he gave on how the truth is propagated. How do we get truth out there? How does it advance in the world? On the propagation of truth, a sermon he gave. And he says, when we look at why the gospel spread in the early Roman Empire, the fact, use of coercion, no. Miracles, no. Miracles help. If you could do miracles, do that, by the way. But what really made it happen? And this is his answer. He says, the gospel is ultimately advanced, not by books, not by argument, nor by temporal power, but by the personal influence of such men and women who are at once the teachers and patterns of it. People persuade themselves with little difficulty to scoff at principles, to ridicule books, to make sport of the names of good men and women. But they cannot bear their presence. They cannot bear their presence. It is holiness embodied in personal form which they cannot steadily confront and bear down. So that the silent conduct of a conscientious man or woman secures for him or her from beholders a feeling different in kind from any which is created by the mere versatile and garrulous reason. Deductions have no power of persuasion. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. My favorite line, one of my favorite lines from Newman, right here. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. End quote. Who you are as a missionary disciple makes all the difference. Catholic leadership is not simply about having the best arguments. You do need to study. It's not simply about, you need the arguments. Catholic leadership is not about being super gifted. Oh, if only I was as gifted as Sally, who can sing so well, then I could really attract people to me and then they'd want to hear the gospel. Or if I was a great athlete, but wouldn't it be great if I was a great athlete and I was a Christian, then everyone would think, wow, what a great athlete, a Christian, I could be a role model. Those are good things. But they're not essential to Christian leadership. Christian leadership does not depend on gifting. Christian leadership depends on bearing witness to the truth of the gospel in your very life. It depends on the kind of person you are. So it's character first. Character first. There are plenty of gifted people in Scripture who failed in character and therefore failed the gospel. I think of Solomon. Who's more gifted than Solomon? All the wealth in the world, all the wisdom in the world. The Scripture tells us he failed in character, and thus Israel was worshiping false gods. Who you are matters because looks move us, deeds inflame us, voices melt us. So the other side of encounter is not just going and doing it, but being the kind of person who, in doing it, is testimony to something greater than yourself. So I'd say this to you as leaders, and you are leaders, and I want to thank you for saying yes to leadership. A lot of people run from leadership. It's a pain in the neck. It comes at a cost. It's someone else's problem. There's a certain cynicism around leader. Oh, I'm a leader. There's a certain cynicism about genuine leaders. You see the hollowness of certain figures in the public realm. But if you're in this room, you've probably said yes to the Lord that you want to lead. That somehow you're saying yes to something. And I want to thank you for saying yes, and I want to tell you you need to continue to say yes. You'll be asked more than once whether you're in this for the long haul, because it is for the long haul. But your leadership will live or die based on your willingness to be conformed to God and to suffer for love of other people, to genuinely enter in encuentro to the joys and hopes and to the sorrows and sufferings of other people. Only that's going to change the world at its deepest level. This is a quote from Benedict XVI. It's from his encyclical on hope. And it's on love. And to my mind, it's one of these expressions of what it means, the kind of person we need to be. This is the kind of person who can actually, by personal influence, change the world. It's the person who loves like this. And it speaks to the temptation to not love, because it's a pain. Benedict is famous. Right before he became Pope, he gave a speech in which he said, human beings aren't called to comfort, they're called to greatness. He's a great enemy of comfort. He said, one of the dangers of the modern world is it can make you comfy and bored, but you're kind of content being comfy. So you're not willing to go for greatness. You're not willing to really suffer, to reach out. And so he's constantly calling, especially young people, reach out. Be willing to suffer. Be willing to go to the other side of the river. Be willing to go to the downtown. Be willing to put yourself in places that are uncomfortable. Benedict XVI, Francis even says, give up your stuff. And a quote I won't read you, on detachment. He says, you really want to serve, you want to change the world, you want to build fraternity? Get rid of your stuff. Because you got too much stuff. And stuff gets in the way of real relationship. All of it comes at a cost. The way Christ loved, so we love. It comes with the cross as well as the resurrection. Here's the quote from Benedict XVI. Love simply cannot exist without the painful renunciation of self, for otherwise it becomes pure selfishness and thereby ceases to be love. To suffer with the other and for others, to suffer for the sake of truth and justice, to suffer out of love and in order to become a person who truly loves. These are fundamental elements of humanity. It's when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensations of meaninglessness, end quote. We've come full circle. The very thing that Francis has diagnosed as what's wrong, and that's healed by love, is the very thing Benedict says is what happens when you have a world that doesn't have love, both in our personal lives and more broadly, a life of meaninglessness. To be called to leadership, y'all, is to be called to suffer for love. It just is. There's a certain kind of romanticism about serving the poor that can happen when you take kids on high school groups or you take kids on mission trips. It's fine, it's natural, it's part of human nature. Wow, I went down to Honduras and we built this home and I played soccer with these kids and it was really cool and I gave them a soccer ball and that's all good. That's good. It's especially good for the kids going and doing it, frankly. But the kind of leadership that actually changes the world, that's introduction. The kind of leadership that changes the world is the kind of love, is the kind of leadership that is willing to suffer for love for the long haul, that will perdure in this, despite the cost. This is true of marriage. Some of you married, some of you thinking of getting married. Marriage has suffering love built into it. Let me tell you, it's the greatest thing in the world. To love like this is joy. This is the great irony. People didn't look at Mother Teresa and think, she's so gloomy, despite what she was going on interiorly. To suffer for love is the road to joy. That's perfect freedom. That's how you don't worry about anything. You're free to love. You're not afraid of suffering. I remember being deeply moved by someone who once said to me, it was 2008, we were talking about the financial collapse. He was running a college at the time. He was president of a college, and we were talking. And he had come from very humble background, come from dirt poverty. And I asked him, what do you think 2008, all this stuff's going on? And he goes, you know what, I'm not afraid of poverty because I've lived it. And I'm thinking, I'm afraid of poverty. I don't want to be poor. He was freer than I was because he wasn't afraid of it. He'd suffered it, he lived it. He was free. To the extent we're willing to live a suffering love, we're going to be free and we're going to have joy. What a strange gospel we believe in. That to gain your life, you must lose it. What crazy talk. But that's the fundamental reality. And so I'd like to end where Pope Francis ends and says, become missionary disciples. Missionary disciples who are willing to suffer for love. For the sake of the world, for you, for your own joy, for the joy of the whole world. Transform the world by being willing to suffer for love. This is the vision of Gaudium et Spes. It's the vision of JP2, the vision of Pope Francis, vision of Benedict, the vision for our world. May God give us the grace to live it. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
Again, I would like to express a word of thanks to Dr. Reyes for joining us this evening and for giving us a wonderful challenge in a way to make our day here and our reflection on Gaudium et Spes tangible. Thank you for that challenge for missionary discipleship. On behalf of all of us present, especially the Knights, the CAC, the Archdiocese of Washington, we have just a small token of appreciation and gratitude for you being with us today. As we conclude this afternoon, I would like to welcome to the podium Father Frank Donio, who is the director of this Catholic Apostolate Center, but also the chaplain for the Knights of Columbus Council here at the Catholic University of America. Father Frank.
Thank you, Johnny. You've been doing a lot of listening. And Dr. Reyes gave us our charge that comes from Pope Francis, but really comes from definitely 50 years before, but more so 2,000 years before. Because everybody who is here, who is a Catholic leader, must be baptized. And if we're baptized, then as the council clearly taught, we're sent into the world to transform that world. Gaudium et Spes, number 45. While helping the world and receiving many benefits from it, the Church has a single intention: that God's kingdom may come, and that the salvation of the whole human race may come to pass. For every benefit which the people of God during its earthly pilgrimage can offer to the human family stems from the fact that the Church is the universal sacrament of salvation, simultaneously manifesting and rising the mystery of God's love. We're called to go out from here. Go out, and you're welcome to worship with us at 4 o'clock. But at the end of that worship, we're told, go. Not just focus on ourselves, but glorifying the Lord by our life. Glorifying the Lord is not just talking about it. It's doing it, living it. All the things we reflected on are wonderful. But if we don't live them, they're worthless and they're just simply information. We've had some wonderful encounters of the vision that the Church offers us and the how to do it. But each one of us is baptized will do it differently in our own unique way. But we're not given a pass on doing it. So as we leave from here, we thank all of those who gave of their time to be with us today. We thank all of you for coming and being a part of this opportunity to be formed together, because the Spirit of God is among us, who is forming us as well. Thank you for this opportunity to be together with you. Thank you to my brother Knights. Thank you to the Archdiocese of Washington. Thank you to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the various representatives who were with us today. And to those from the Catholic University of America. It has been an enriching day a day of formation, but also an opportunity for us to now go. Thank you.